and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, G20 finance ministers meeting concluded in Shanghai. After failing to meet growth target rates this year, G20 nations continue to formulate plans for structural reform. But will they work? And evolving power relations. We take a look at China's relationship with the world's great powers. What lies ahead? Welcome to World Insight on CCTV News. We start today's show in Shanghai, where the Group of 20 finance and central bank governors meeting concluded with the world's top economies in agreement that some measures are needed urgently to support global economic growth. Take a look at this.
Continued efforts to strengthen the global economy. The Group of 20 finance ministers and central bank governors gathered in Shanghai over the weekend to discuss the global recovery. In January, the International Monetary Fund forecast the global economy to grow 3.4% this year and 3.6% next year, both 0.2 percentage points lower than its forecast last October. Then, earlier this week, the IMF highlighted increasing risks to the global recovery and called for urgent and bold actions to spur growth.
Our conclusion, which I shared with the members of the G20, is that without collective, deliberate action on the part of policymakers and implementation, there is a risk that the recovery could derail.
After long discussions at the G20 finance meeting, all the participants agreed to renew their focus on structural reforms to prevent further downside risks.
The meetings underlined that we will take all necessary policy tools, both individually and collectively, including monetary, fiscal, and structural reforms, to lift market sentiment and revive growth, and keep the debt ratio at sustainable levels.
The world economy has been plodding along a bumpy road in its efforts to recover. Major economies have adopted various innovative monetary and fiscal stimulus measures to boost output, but the effects still remain to be seen. China has announced that it will not resort to competitive currency depreciation to benefit its exports and economic growth. Taking into consideration the vast appreciation of the yuan in the past decade, the recent adjustments to the exchange rate of its currency have so far been quite mild and should not be overinterpreted. Observers note that a stable yuan is in the interest of China itself, its neighbors, and the world economy as a whole.
Well, will the agreement at the G20 finance and central bank governor meeting in Shanghai be eventually implemented or not? We are joined here in the Beijing studio by Professor Liu Baocheng, who is the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Meanwhile, joining us from Washington, D.C., we have Mr. Paulo Mauro, who is a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, Mr. Mauro, may I have your opinion about why is it so difficult to translate the rhetoric into actions, particularly structural reform, for every country? I saw your smile on your face. You probably have a really good answer for this, Mr. Mauro.
Well, indeed, it is difficult because structural reform is a very vague term, and the priorities differ across countries. Normally, when I think of structural reform, I think of liberalization of the economy, I think of reducing regulations, reducing restrictions, making it easier for firms to hire and fire workers, for people to move within their country or even across national boundaries. So it's a whole host of possible measures, and the priorities there differ very much across countries. For some countries, the priority would be to speed up the processes whereby you adjudicate civil lawsuits. For other countries, it may be labor market reform. And the way that this is translated into practice is to have a system of peer monitoring
Yes.
among the G20, but this is not a very well developed system. It's not something that features on the front page of the domestic newspapers. So there's a good intention, but the implementation is something that still remains to be seen.
But Mr. Marlow, briefly from you, if you can, when the growth rate of the global economy is going down, likely to be 3.4 or even lower by April, is it possible for economies and pragmatic for economies to do structural reform? Let's just talk about realities.
Well, I think it is possible. I think at the same time we should not overstate the degree of crisis or emergency. I think at the end of the day, we are not in a global recession. Certainly the United States is growing at a normal pace. It has something close to full employment. Europe is recovering. It's not growing very fast, but it is growing. Again, there are differences across countries, but things are okay. They're on the right track. If you look at the emerging markets, it's very different across emerging markets. You have India still growing very fast. You have China where there's discussion of a potential slowdown, but what we are seeing is that the numbers are still giving us a very mild slowdown. The economy is still growing at 6–7%, which is unheard of for an advanced economy. And then you have Brazil and Russia, which are in recession. So it's very different. Now, can you do structural reforms in a situation of crisis? Yes, sometimes that's the moment to do it. But again, we're not in a crisis. So I would say we're in a situation where there's a lot of discussion of structural reforms, but the reality is that countries are trying to do the best they can for themselves.
I see.
And it's good that there's international dialogue, but I'm not sure that countries are going to do more than they would simply on the basis of their own self-interest.
If you talk about the numbers, let's take a look at the numbers. You said the economy is not necessarily slowing down as some has indicated in the press, for example. But take a look at this. According to the IMF's figure, the emerging economies, excluding China, in this point, excluding China, gained only 1.92 growth last year, even lower than the developed economies' 1.98%. It is the very first time the emerging economies' growth is lower than that of the developed world since the year 2009. Some say this is already a story of decline of the emerging economies, of course, in this case, excluding China. Professor Liu, you've been attentive listening to your American colleagues. What is your judgment? Is this a very difficult economic realities that we are facing, and therefore structural reform, is it still pragmatic?
Well, 5 years ago, people really...
Professor Liu in Beijing, please.
Yes, 5 years ago, people bet on the Asia and most of the emerging economies that are dragging the global recovery. And right now, it's a really a blurred reality now when those developing countries are faced with its own problem, be it interest rate issue, be it inflation issue, be it labor issue. Well, I think it all boils down to a matter of management. So people always say there is no really underdeveloped country, but there is a lot of undermanaged country. So management turned out to be a challenge both at the government level and also at the business level. So right now, when the global economy is seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, I'm not really very optimistic about whether we have really moved out of this cycle of recession. So before we really get full recovered, we may have the risk to fall into another trap of the vicious cycle if we do not really cooperate well.
let's just put whether we're in another recession or the beginning of another cycle or not for later discussion. Let's just concentrate on what this G20 finance ministers and central bank governors eventually decided. They talk about, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and structural reform all go at the same time. But obviously, over the past year, everybody knows that every country is focusing on the previous two, which is the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. Yeah. How to avoid what they consider as so-called a competitive devaluation of everyone's currency in order to get an upper hand of exports. That is the question. Would claiming, promising at these kind of meetings necessarily going to lead to actions?
Well, it is good to see increased consensus at this round of G20, but as discussed, that there are really different interpretations, different agenda, different priorities in the structural reform, and different understanding among different policymakers so far. So therefore, we really expect that based on this consensus, there can be more transparent agenda. So that the world can really have a collective action, so towards a constructive movement.
Well,
so that also is related with the elimination of the rising protectionism that is on the way.
Well, all of these, which you said, Professor Liu, sound wonderful, but Mr. Mauro, what do you consider as the most effective way to avoid this competitive devaluation? You already mentioned about peer monitoring. Of course, G20 is a system, but it has not yet gone into the most mature stage in order to have it possible. So what about the other mechanisms? Will countries' pledges eventually lead to actions from your perspective?
Well, if I have to make a guess on the main policies that countries are going to use in the next year or so, I would say that if you're looking at the case of Europe, we will soon see a little bit more stimulative monetary policy, so perhaps a slight reduction in interest rates, going a little bit more negative. I would advocate more quantitative easing in Europe. In the United States, I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of new policy measures, simply because fiscal policy is not going to take any actions between now and the elections. On monetary policy, I think that we may see a couple of very small, very gradual increases in interest rates, if at all, in the United States. In Europe, on fiscal policy, there's a bit of a discussion going on with several countries pressuring Germany to do more stimulus, but I don't see that that's going to be very likely. The one thing that could happen is that with the intensification of the refugee crisis in Europe, countries are going to agree that spending to integrate refugees may be something that could be excluded from the fiscal rules, and therefore, if that happens, you might see a small fiscal stimulus there.
Right. Let's have our European guest, Daniel Gross, who is joining us. Mr. Gross is the director of the Center for European Policy Studies. Mr. Gross, obviously you heard a lot talk coming from your American counterpart talking about the European policies. You got a lot of things on hand. First of all, the last crisis seems to be not yet ending. Secondly, you got migrant crisis, which is more political. And thirdly, you also got several countries, particularly the UK, talking about exit the EU unless it is being, in a way, met with certain kinds of policies and policy changes. So, Mr. Gross, what do you make of all of this?
This looks almost like a perfect storm for Europe. We have crises on all imaginable policy fields. So all we can do at this point is to tackle these things one by one. The UK problem has been tackled in the sense that David Cameron has been given a special deal. Now it's up to him to sell it to the British public. On the refugee crisis, there's not much actually Europe can do. The action is now with member countries and with a non-member country, namely Turkey. If they don't stop the flow, again, Europe can only take these refugees and does its best. On the economic side, however, I think the worst is behind us. The European economy is actually improving slowly but nicely. And employment is actually doing better in Europe than the United States. So I think the economic crisis is pretty much behind us, but the other two crises, they still have to be dealt with.
Well, that's the situation in Europe. What about China? G20 meetings are supposed to be occasions, particularly when it's being held in China, in which developing countries, emerging economies, particularly China, to ask the rest of the community as to whether emerging economies should have the proportion that they are promised to have in terms of the economic governing of the world. But this time, of course, Chinese officials had a lot to explain. Yes. Professor Liu, you understand this better than I do. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang promised the international community of China's, quote, having enough resources to deal with so-called downward pressure of the economy. What do you make of his promises? And also Central Bank Governor Zhou Xiaochuan, together with the Finance Minister Lou Jiwei's repeated confirmation about the prospect of the Chinese economy?
Well, I think now in the government hands they have a number of toolkits. You know, they have the now gradually rolling out the more progressive monetary policy. So there is visible easing of the money into the liquidity. So that can really sharpen the stock exchange performance and also provide a more friendly financial environment for Chinese economic growth. The other is supply side reform by right now, you know, the State Council has pledged 100 billion to transfer the skill of possible laid out workers by reducing the excessive capacity.
I see.
And Li Keqiang is so much so resolved to continue to cut down the red tapes that are in the way of economic growth and efficiency. And also China's export is experiencing difficulty, but still we remain the #1 exporter in China. And also we see the continued increase in the flow of both foreign direct investment to China and also outbound investment from China.
Okay, so you give a long list about what are some of the plus Chinese economy is having right now in order to guarantee the growth. But Mr. Cross, what about from your perspective? You know, things about the debts, things about the securities market, things about the confidence of the Chinese economy, things about how Chinese community, rather Chinese economy, is interacting with the rest of the world, policy-wise and action-wise. What is your judgment, Mr. Gross?
One always has to distinguish between what certain policy is supposed to achieve and what it might actually achieve in the end. So if I look at the Chinese monetary policy right now, I hear that the purpose is to stimulate more investment in China. But China is also an economy where there are more savers than investors. There's a huge saving surplus. So lowering interest rates will cut into the interest earnings of savers, who then might have less money to spend. And therefore, I'm not so sure that lower interest rates will actually stimulate the Chinese economy, especially consumption in China, which one should do. So I'm a bit skeptical that the current policy direction will actually achieve what is needed, because what is needed is to foster consumption, and that might need more fiscal policy than monetary policy.
Professor Liu, that is only one aspect that Mr. Gross talked about. But there are many other aspects. For example, about the exchange rate regime, China is reforming it, but as a result, we see different kinds of phenomena emerging. Some worry about capital flights, others say this is not a problem at all. Of course, we see debates coming from all sides. What is your judgment about the Chinese government's capabilities and the Chinese economy's capabilities of managing its own path?
I think the direction is very clear. The Chinese government is so resolved to continue the liberalization process of the Chinese RMB, both for its international status and also for domestic reform and also for the attraction of more foreign capital into China. But this decision has to meet a number of challenges. Number one is that we have been not very experienced in managing a free-flowing monetary issue. And number two is that we really wanted to sharpen the domestic economic growth rate while we maintain a more stable monetary policy. So that's something, sometimes at the grudge. And again, the supply side reform also need more predictability while we allow the market fluctuation in a wider band. So these are the issues that we have to be very careful. So lastly, I think more of the global financial speculators, they are in a tug of war with the Chinese policymakers and also Chinese bankers. And let's see who is going to win out in the end.
Well, there are different factors you could put on the positive list and the challenging list. Always like that when it comes to the economy. But for now, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for coming over for this discussion. Liu Baocheng, Daniel Gross, and Paolo Malo. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Stay with us here on World Insight. We've got our final segment coming right up. Evolving power relations. We take a look at China's relationships with the world's great powers. What lies ahead? Namely the US and Russia. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. Chinese President Xi Jinping has made it clear that among his top priorities for China are the construction of a new type of international relations that focuses on win-win cooperation. In the following 4 days, we'll be holding a series of discussions on China's diplomacy, China's global vision. Today, we will begin with China's relations with major countries.
The world's great powers. Past few years have proved that China is facing a turbulent time in its international status. Issue after issue has arisen. In such a climate, the manner in which China cooperates with other major countries is crucial. As the most significant developed and developing countries across the Pacific, Beijing and Washington's interactions continue to occupy the headlines. Over the last 3 years, a series of frequent state visits, meetings and phone calls have clearly demonstrated mutual efforts in improving Sino-US relations. After hours talking at Sunnylands in June of 2013, President Xi and President Obama reached a consensus in pursuing a new type of bilateral relationship, which they declared would be based on non-conflict, non-confrontation, mutual respect and win-win cooperation. President Xi's state visit to the US in the autumn of 2015 was also quite productive. Massive agreements on a wide range of issues, from climate change to nuclear non-proliferation, were reached. However, recent rising tensions in the South China Sea have shown disagreements also exist in this partnership. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi responded to media reports that China was building radar facilities in the region.
I hope the media will not only see the radar, but more importantly perhaps, that every day the advanced armaments and equipment emerging in the South China Sea, including the missile bombers, the strategic destroyers, why people have chosen to ignore them.
China's relationship with Russia, its biggest neighbor, is also very important. There's no official alliance between the nations, but both are dedicated to mutual prosperity. This has been defined as a new type of Sino-Russia relationship. Russia has always been a significant strategic partner for China. Since 2013, the country's heads of state have met 12 times. In 2015, President Putin and President Xi traveled to each other's countries to attend commemoration parades for losses sustained during World War II. At the time, Putin said that Sino-Russian bilateral relations were experiencing a high point. With frequent exchanges among these major countries, last year witnessed breakthrough cooperation efforts for China with both the US and Russia. Among these achievements were the environmental agreement reached in Paris and the Iranian nuclear deal. President Xi has said working towards common goals is in the best interests of global stability and prosperity.
For more on China's diplomacy, particularly China's relations with what considered as so-called the big powers of the world, we're joined here in the Beijing studio Yuan Peng, who is the Vice President of China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Welcome, sir. Also joining us from Moscow in Russia, we are having Mr. Dmitry Barbich, who is the political analyst from Sputnik International News Agency. Welcome as well, sir. First of all, Mr. Yuan, many wonder, beginning from President Xi's administration, whether China has shifted at all its focus of strategic partnership from US-China to now China-Russia. Many have this question. What is your answer?
Yes, I still remember when I was in the States, right after the Xi came into power, some Americans very interestingly asked me if the Americans still your first priority, because U.S.-China is the first priority of Chinese diplomacy. It's a long time talk in both the United States and China. I say, why? Because they told me that they have noticed that President Xi's first visit is to Russia. And aftermath, they see a very warm Sino-Russian relations. Putin visited Beijing and Xi visited Russia again, and each year almost 5 to 6 times for those two leaders to meet. So many Americans said, oh, it seems that now China-Russian relations is the first priority. So my answer is no. I think both US and Russia have the same importance to China, but they have totally different means. For example, Russia is important because of its not only a big power, big military, and also it's our biggest labor country. So it's both big power and big labor. That's why it's very important. But the United States is important in many aspects. For example, economically speaking, we have more than 500 billion trade amounts, and elective side to say that American influence all the co-interests of China, like Taiwan, Tibet, South China Sea, all those interests. So in terms of this, and the U.S. also important. So for China, it's how to balance those two very important big power relations, U.S. and China, and Russia and China. And so far, I think we get a very good balance.
Well, we also have now Robert Ross, who is a professor of political science at Boston College and associate at the John King Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies with Harvard University. Professor Ross, welcome to our program. Great to have you. What do you make of your colleague here in Beijing, Yuan Peng's statements that China is trying to keep a balance between Moscow and Washington?
Well, Yuan Peng is an old friend, so I'm very pleased to be on this program with him. I think we need to understand the very different relationship and very different impact the United States and Russia have on Chinese security. We need to understand that Russian presence in the Russian Far East on the Chinese border is close to zero. This has particularly been the case in the last 2 or 3 years as the Russians have had to move many of their very best troops out of the Far East over into the Caucasus and Eastern Europe to deal with NATO and problems in the Ukraine and now in Syria. And of course, there's no infrastructure in the Russian Far East. And so for the Chinese, the Russians are not a security problem, but simultaneously they're not much of an asset or a contribution either, because the Russians really can help the Chinese deal with America in East Asia, because the Russians are preoccupied with their problems in Europe. And so in this regard, the primary consideration for the Chinese should be a combination of two things, I would suggest. One is how to use the rise of Chinese power, the rise of China, to achieve accomplishments in East Asia for Chinese security, while simultaneously maximizing U.S.-China cooperation. This is inherently a very difficult task, one which has been fraught with problems in recent years.
Well, we also have Mr. Barbich coming from Russia. You have been, sir, attentively listening to your other two colleagues coming from Washington and Beijing. So Russia's vision, which chair is more comfortable for Russia to be an ever closer partner with China, even more strategically important for China than Washington? Is that what you're seeking for when it comes to Moscow's vision? Or a very pragmatic partnership that we are talking about here?
Well, I think that Washington and the European Union, they simply left Russia no choice but to seek as close a cooperation with Russia, with China as possible. The actions of the United States and the European Union in the last 5 years in particular were so irrational that they made Sino-Russian cooperation an inevitability. Let me tell you, for example, that for many years Russia had this project of supplying natural gas to China, and the project did not move very fast because the Chinese offered a pretty low price. So what happened was that right after the conflict with Russia over Ukraine, President Obama went to the West Pacific and reassured all of China's adversaries. You know, he visited Japan, he visited the Philippines, and everywhere he spoke about the United States supporting these countries against possible Chinese hegemony. So in the end, the Chinese raised the price, and Mr. Putin had a chance to go to Beijing and sign a pretty good agreement on the supplies of Russian natural gas. And I want to add that Russia wants to have good relations with both East and West. In general, Russia is culturally closer to Europe,
of course,
and even to the United States than to China. But the irrational policies of Mr. Obama and his predecessors simply left Russia no choice.
I see.
If we want to survive in the global environment, we can't survive alone. So if the United States and the EU are so hostile, we will get closer to China.
Oh, Mr. Yuan Peng, in Beijing, is China ever closer to the similar strategic position, or in a way paradox, as Russia is on the one hand want to have very good relations with the West, particularly US, on the other hand on some strategic significant issues such as South China Sea and many others, there is a sharp difference when it comes to opinions between Washington and Beijing.
I think today is not a Cold War era now.
Not anymore.
Where everyone knows that the triangular relations among China, Soviet, and the United States during the Cold War. So some want to make something similar to today's the triangular, Russia, China, the States, to the Cold War type of triangular, but totally different. During the Cold War, I think the nature of the triangular is to check. There's a US-China relations is to check Soviet. But today, I think we use a term of balance. For example, when China developed our relations to Russia, we want to make sure that reassure the United States that our bilateral relations is not target the third parties, the United States. The same case when Sino-Russia, China, the States' new model of the relations, it's not against Russia. So balance of the powers today is highest rule. I think the reason why Sino-Russian relations today is the best shape. First of all, I think because we have no any more border disputes or sovereignty disputes. This is very important. And secondly, we shared very similar worldview, the vision of the world, the vision of the international relations, is the same. And thirdly, I think both share of the same period of our rise over recovery of our economy. And another additional reason is that President Putin and President Xi, they have very good personal relations.
All right, but one thing we need to mention here when it comes to US-China relations, both of you and Professor Ross keep on mentioning about the very new era that we are facing and the new type of relations. We used to have a saying, so-called same bed, different dreams, and that has been such a political rhetoric spreading around the academic communities in China and also US. And now people are talking about different version. They say different beds and different dreams, meaning different visions about the world and different ways of achieving different visions about the world between Washington and Beijing. So what's going on here? Are we getting ever farther apart, Professor Yuan?
Yeah.
Professor Ross, I'm going to let you respond to that as well, but Professor Yuan first, briefly.
I think before my good friend Bob Ross' response, I will remind me of this very famous title from my another American friend's David Lampton's book,
Right.
Same Bed, Different Dreams. I prefer using the different beds and the different dreams because actually we're never in the same bed at all. Right after the Cold War, we are totally in the different beds, and sometimes we have the same dreams, but many other times we have different dreams. Maybe sometimes we have same vision, but how to achieve the vision and the way to mean it is different. For example, in dealing with the Korean crisis, nuclear crisis, China prefer to use dialogue, negotiation, comprehensive ways, but Americans sometimes prefer to use sanction and military ways.
Let me go to Professor Ross immediately. Professor Ross, different beds, different dreams. How big are the beds and how different are they? DPRK issue, is that likely to be one issue that we can focus on to tell the realities?
First, I agree with Yuan Peng that this is not a Cold War, nor is it likely to become a Cold War. This is in two respects. One, we do have many differences on security issues in the South China Sea, but what's remarkable is that we can separate these issues out. So we cooperate on North Korea with UN sanctions, we cooperate on the environment, we still have good meetings and summits, and of course we trade a lot. Nothing like that of a mixed relationship existed during the Cold War, nor is that likely to develop in our relationship. Second, the triangular relationship is much less severe today. Of course, the Sino-Russian relationship is very cooperative, but we don't, from the American side, we do not see Russian cooperation and assistance to China as a major factor for American security in East Asia. Nor do we see Chinese assistance to Russia as a major factor in Europe. Whereas, of course, during the Cold War, we saw this Sino-Soviet alliance as contributing and partnering to cooperate against the United States. Very different era. Now, on the one hand, we both exist in Asia. We both exist in East Asia, and there's no getting away from that. But clearly, we have different expectations and different objectives. The United States is a status quo power. The Chinese naturally, as the expression goes, way. The Chinese want to accomplish things as their power has risen. And so that the status quo is difficult for them with the American domination of the South China Sea and the East China Sea and alliances around China's perimeter. And so our basic fundamental conflict is we have different objectives in East Asia, and this will be hard to manage.
And of course, Professor Ross, you know this better than I do, that there has been a lot of talk from both countries talking about agenda against one another because of the different visions and so-called different dreams. What do you think the realities are? And particularly when you have pivot to Asia, rebalance in Asia, you also have the presidential election going on, likely to be more rhetoric coming from the candidates. That's only natural, but on the other hand, it does harm the relations. And what to expect, Professor Ross?
Well, again, I agree with Yuan Peng. We have been in different beds since the end of the Cold War. As the two most significant countries in the world, the most capable countries in the world, operating in East Asia, a vital region for both of us, this is an intrinsically competitive relationship. I don't think we have an agenda of opposing each other, but indeed we do compete because we are concerned about each other's intentions and capabilities. Our election will get difficult. We have an experience with this, of course, in the past. But as we watch the election, China is not the most important issue. We're dealing with many issues in the United States, including the Middle East, including Syria, including immigration, including the economy. And so my hope is that the role of U.S. policy toward China remains a secondary issue in the U.S.-China relationship. Now, the United States also has a challenge. I mentioned earlier the Chinese government has a challenge in managing both its rise and instability in East Asia. The Americans have a challenge. We need to find a way to maintain our security and resist excessive Chinese demands. Well, we also need cooperation with China. Very important for us. And I must say, this has been a challenge for U.S. foreign policy as well.
Right. Well, it's been there for quite some time. Mr. Barbage, given all the circumstances the other two guests from China and U.S. were talking about, what does it mean for Russia? What kind of chances and opportunities would those circumstances mean for Russia, the chemistry between China and Washington?
Well, I would say that if we look at this triangle, China, Russia, the United States, if you look closer at history, you will see that each of these countries wants the other two to compete with each other, while this third country would try to enjoy good relations with the other two poles of this triangle. And if you look at history, the bad guy, I would say the insanity moved from one country to another. Of course, the Soviet Union under Stalin and his successors was not a very predictable state. So this made the Sino-American alliance in the 1970s possible, when Nixon came to Beijing, a proverbial situation. Right now, unfortunately, the unpredictable pole, the dangerous pole, is the United States. Because even if you look at the symbolic things, why did Mr. Obama decide not to come to China for the parade to commemorate the end of the World War II? Why he didn't come to Russia for the same kind of parade? Russia and China lost more people than any other nations during the World War II. So symbolically, it was a very aggressive and I would say disrespectful attitude from Mr. Obama. So in this situation, when you have one of the poles behaving irrationally, the other two poles usually unite against it. And this is the long-term trend that I foresee in the future.
Okay, very interesting over there. You see, Professor Yuan, when it comes to discussion with China, US, and China-Russia, the focus is different. China-Russia, very specific cases, as our Russian guests talk about. China-US, very strategic views coming from both of you. So eventually, your judgment here, where is China? Where is this balance?
I think China's way to manage those triangular relations is to becoming a bridge, because today I think the top three military powers and top three permanent members of the Security Council, we want to work together. If those three countries working together, the world war is totally unimaginable. And the space cooperation also another example. I know that the US and Russia has very good space cooperation, so I hope in the future we can have a triangular cooperation.
Very beautiful conclusion coming from Mr. Yuan here. But for now, I want to thank the three of you, Yuan Peng here in Beijing, Robert Ross in the US, and Dmitry Barbich in Moscow. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you so much. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us. You can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.